when people ask me what my book is about, which is often, the easiest way to describe it is to say that it's about suicide, which is very much true. Um, Although that's never an easy thing to say, even though I've been doing it now for about 10 years. And part of that is that as soon as I say that, I'm launching myself and whomever I'm speaking with into what is inevitably kind of a heavy conversation. And that has been hugely valuable to me throughout the process of writing and talking about this book, because it's made me realize that people really do want to talk about this subject that I think a lot of people assume people don't want to talk about. But the other reason that it's hard for me to say this when people ask me is because my book, of course, is about many other things besides suicide. And sometimes I want to talk about those other things, but it's harder to kind of anchor a conversation in that. Some of those things are obsession, grief, the 90s, which I love to talk about and will talk about with you forever. But I think more than anything, my book is about adolescence. And the parts of it that are specifically rooted in adolescence were absolutely my favorite parts to write. Even though it's such a horrible time of life, it really was a joy to write these parts. So that's what I'm going to focus this little talk I'm doing and reading on tonight. Oop. So this is a photograph of me when I was 13. My mom, hi mom, had wanted to stage a photo shoot of me holding the 3 musical instruments I played, which are clarinet, flute, and piano. And I'm still convinced that there is absolutely no way to take a sexy photograph of someone holding these 3 musical instruments. If you know of a way to do that, please send me the photo. But it's especially unsexy when you're 13 years old, which is sort of a wholly unflattering time of life for most humans. So if you can't tell from this photo, I have really long hair. It's always really dirty. I only wash it about once a week at this time in my life on Thursday nights. I don't know why Thursday nights, but because of that, there was constantly this like knot at the back of my head. We called it a snarl. I don't know if that's common language still, but I just had this like perpetual knot in my thick, dirty hair. I'm also wearing this fantastic shirt. I don't know if anyone remembers this shirt from the 90s, called History of Art, that has 9 stick figure drawings in the style of these 9 famous, mostly white artists. And it was one of these shirts that was really popular, and I didn't really know anything about art, but it made me feel really sort of like cultured to wear it. I also, underneath that shirt, I'm wearing like a really ratty sports bra from Sears that I also never really washed. As you can tell, I just didn't have a very good sense of personal hygiene at this time. I was definitely in the middle of like peaking awkward phase. I'm just like sort of hunched, sort of boyish, like just very, very unconfident about myself. And I, on some level, must have known that, but I'm sure I did not admit it to myself, because that would have released a kind of vulnerability that I think might have destroyed me. But I also was a very passionate teenager. This year I was very into Jurassic Park, which came out the previous summer. It still is like my favorite movie of all time, but I was like on a Jurassic Park high for a long time after that. I also played a lot of Tetris on a hand-me-down Nintendo that came from my older brothers, that was hooked up to an old computer monitor in my bedroom. And I listened to a lot of classical music on vinyl that I borrowed from the town library, which is probably the coolest thing I could have done as a 13-year-old. And I was also really into this boy, who I will call Brett. That's what I call him in the book. It's not his real name. It's still kind of funny to say that, but sticking with it for now. So I knew Brett from school band. He played the trumpet. He was sort of the star trumpet player, which relatively speaking is not saying a lot considering like the level of talent of a middle school band, but he actually was legitimately really talented. Often when I'm talking about Brett, I describe him as a friend. I'll say, like, if I'm talking about my book, but he was absolutely not a friend. My quota sort of for friendship at this time in my life was that, like, if I talked on the phone with you, then you were legitimately a friend. And I definitely had Brett's phone number and called him frequently just to hear his voice and hang up, but we didn't actually talk on the phone. I would say he was like more of an acquaintance, but even that feels like a really formal word for people who are 13 and 14 years old. We did legitimately have 4 or 5 conversations with each other, one of which took place over one very special afternoon that we shared a lunch in the school cafeteria. I don't sadly remember a lot from that moment, but the one detail that really sticks out in my mind is that he was drinking a diet Snapple. Because I remember thinking, like, God, is he one of these kids that comes from a family that drinks all diet versions of everything? I feel like I had a lot of friends at this time where, like, one of their parents or both of their parents were trying to lose weight, and all of a sudden, like, their whole house was filled with diet stuff, and it was just like a big phenomenon in the 90s. And I remember that detail sticking with me because it made me realize how little I knew about this person. And at this time in your life, especially in the 90s before social media, you know, if you liked someone that you went to school with, you really only knew what they wanted you to know or they wanted to show you, which for me was not a lot. And it was mostly logistical. Like, I knew, you know, what classes Brett took and like where his locker was and what bus he was on, but I didn't know a whole lot beyond that. And the diet Snapple made me feel like, oh God, like, I only know the tip of the iceberg. There's this whole life that this person has that I don't know anything about. And of course, what I'm getting to is that I never really learned because he killed himself a week later. So I grew up in this really small New England town. Um, it was kind of prototypical, like white picket fences, pretty reserved. And needless to say, there wasn't a whole lot of capacity or knowledge or empathy for being able to navigate in a public way the suicide of a teenager. The language I heard a lot when we went back to school after Brett's death was this, which is, Brett would have wanted us to move on. And that seemed like completely ludicrous to me. It sounded like the kind of thing that you say to a kid when their goldfish dies, which actually happened really recently in our family. I don't even remember if I said that to my son Augie, but it did not strike me as the kind of thing that you say when a 14-year-old boy shoots himself. There was really just no capacity for any of us to be able to start a conversation about this. And that sentiment just didn't sit right with me at all. So I took it upon myself at 13 to sort of decide that I was just going to kind of be the vector for this story. And I didn't really know what that looked like then, or certainly that it would take me close to 27 years now to get to this moment. But I've been telling this story in different capacities for this many years. It went from being, you know, like a Sassy Magazine style "It Happened to Me" column, to a series of poems, to a college essay, lots and lots of bad art, some unfinished screenplays. It's even been like fodder in breakup fights, a graduate thesis, and now it has arrived as a book. And it's changed a lot, but the thing that has remained the same is just sort of my persistence to tell a story that the world seemed to me at the time really did not want to hear. And my relationship to this story has also changed. I think for a long time, I felt like the subtext is that this story was a love letter to a person who was never really going to have the opportunity to read it. But in fact, it ended up being sort of a love letter to my 13-year-old self. So on that note, I'm going to make that the theme of this reading and dedicate this to 13-year-old Candace. And I'm also going to share some images of artifacts and objects that she decided to save because she thought that they would help in telling this story. I knew you for a period of 6 months in the middle of my 8th grade year, which was also the exact middle of junior high school. When I think of this time, it presents itself to me like an absence, a span that somehow floats above the timeline of my life, during which I was removed to play a role in a larger story and then returned with none of my belongings and told to pick up where I left off. This era has since assumed the timeless permanency of a film, one that loops every year from October to April, as though it's playing on a grainy little TV in the corner of my existence. Though I have assigned this time a sort of transcendental burden, I'm careful not to describe any of it as fate, a loaded concept that slaps a sort of lazy, prefabricated significance onto our experiences. The matter of our coexistence was nothing, and I made it something. Am still making it something. You, however, had a significance all on your own, even before your death begged us all to look harder. From the beginning, I could not shake the feeling that you did not belong to our small town, to our state of anonymity. You seemed alarmingly out of place to me, as though you weren't supposed to be there at all, or that you had been written in last minute. I would later return to this idea over and over, fruitlessly busying myself with the reasons why people slip in and out of each other's lives. I now attribute this sensation to the unreasonably epic workings of adolescent lust, the whole of which I could write off as juvenile, but choose not to do so. Had it not been for this original magnetism, I would not be writing this, nor would this need to be written, by me at least. You may have ended up the same way. I, however, would not have ended up where I am, a woman who periodically Googles the name of a dead boy who will never experience or even imagine the internet, on the off chance that a key to your existence has made its way to the web, but on a humbler level, because she still enjoys the way your name looks when she has typed it, like a confession. The first things I knew about you. You had 2 trumpets, one everyday brass and one silver that you reserved for performances. You used locker number 740 across from the woodshop near the boiler room. It was a sad, remote location. Your older sister worked at the card shop in the mall. Like me, you took French instead of Spanish, a coincidence that inspired within me a false sense of kinship. You had grown your hair down to your jawline, a bold move in our small town where most boys our age still wore their hair like Mark Paul Gosselaar, a little long on top, gelled to the side, and trimmed clean along the neck. Yours looked more like River Phoenix circa Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, blonde, straight, and long, parted down the middle so that it framed your face. The hair was a sign of maturity disguised as a sign of defiance. On another boy, it might have signaled a rebellious departure from the status quo. We would later find similar hair growth patterns on the boys who smoked pot out of empty Coke cans in their cars behind the high school, but this was junior high. Most of us still had to answer to 1 or 2 parents, and you were hardly cut from the fabric of delinquency. On you, the hair seemed more like a thoughtful decision to step away from expectation toward a sophistication most of us were still too scared to investigate. We had never seen anything like it on a boy close enough to touch. Your talent far exceeded the expectations of junior high school band. You performed with a natural ease that seemed impossible for the rest of us to reach, no matter how musically inclined. Even the children who had been privately trained in the cluttered living rooms of retired musicians still exuded the stiffness of overachievement or an unfortunate arrogance that surpassed their abilities. You managed to eclipse those weaknesses, emanating the kind of talent that made parents insist you were going to be somebody, and you played as though you had already achieved greatness, brow tight and body loose, bending with the music. You often tilted your head a little to the left, causing that River Phoenix hair to fall away from your face and dance around with your movements. Sometimes you held the trumpet using only your right hand, and we knew you were showing off, but we could not argue with what we heard. Tone poured out in smooth, brassy ropes of sound, never ducky, dulling the rest of the trumpet section into a backing chorus. On the rare occasion you fumbled, you'd pull the mouthpiece away from your lips, smile and shake your head, as though sharing a private joke with yourself, and slip back in, never missing more than a couple beats. Watching you play was watching the embodiment of what the rest of us wished we could be, genuinely gifted. What must have attracted us even more than your musical savvy was its juxtaposition with a remoteness that lurked behind your demeanor. Despite our attention, or perhaps because of it, you sometimes disappeared into a sobering fog from which the Brett we knew, hot-headed and audacious, was imperceptible. In these moments, you seemed muted, focused on your music, but operating from a non-traversable distance that dulled your presence. I often noticed it when we passed in a crowded hallway, the way you walked chin down and eyes up, as though searching the rest of us for something. I was never sure what, but your gaze seemed pointed, purposeful. It sounds ridiculous now, me believing I could identify such sophisticated emotions in a 14-year-old boy. Later, of course, your occasional standoffishness would serve as evidence in the case of your demise, but I perhaps naively never interpreted your moodiness as a mood disorder. I read it as mysterious, a deceptive quality in boys that would continue to attract me well into adulthood. A class simply called Health formally warned us of the dangers of teen suicide, but we didn't call it teen suicide. We called it blowing your brains out or slitting your wrists or ODing on something from inside your parents' mirror cabinet, and anyway, it only happened on TV. The odds of it occurring in real life were on par with one of us getting chosen to perform on Star Search. The health instructor presented a film strip on the subject, but it lacked the candor and gravity harnessed for teen pregnancy, drug abuse, or worse, HIV/AIDS. Between the mid-'80s and early 1990s, adolescent HIV diagnoses quadrupled while suicide rates for the same age group plateaued. The HIV crisis frightened us because it reproduced exponentially. We had watched it creep in from what we thought of as the margins, from Africa to America, from the gay community to the hemophiliacs, from drug addicts to their friends of friends who could very well be us. I remember a video about a boy who acquired HIV from becoming blood brothers with another boy. I couldn't recall knowing a single person who had ever performed that ritual, but my inability to relate didn't seem to matter in the era of Ryan White, a boy not unlike us, who had become a victim of the scariest epidemic of our lifetimes after being the recipient of an infected blood transfusion. Ryan was handed to us as an example. If it could happen to him, it could happen to any of us. There is no Ryan White of teen suicide because there is no singular cause toward which we direct the force of our grief and astonishment. In a way, it feels absurd to compare HIV to suicide, a contagious outside force versus a non-communicable internal battle. Perhaps that is why suicide seemed less threatening at the time. It could not be acquired. It began inside a person. There seemed to be no way to avoid it beginning, only ways to notice it had already begun. And the noticing was presented to us as our responsibility. We were given the warning signs and asked to come forward should we detect any of them, a huge obligation for 12 and 13-year-olds for whom overreacting was a risky business. No one wanted to be the kid who told an adult that another kid was acting unusual or depressed, qualities that described most of us on any given day. The buzzwords associated with HIV were far more tangible: sperm, blood, condoms, needles. The related risky business was of a much more straightforward nature. The threat of suicide was too blurry, too elusive. It was barely on our radar. We were more scared of rejection, embarrassment, the threat of our true selves being revealed. And yet, when you did it, we were surprised and not surprised. Health class and made-for-TV movies and very special episodes had shown us that suicide was both preventable and inevitable. Each story had the same math. Teenagers who kill themselves equal their warning signs plus our obliviousness. We were taught to spot those signs, but always in retrospect, always after it was too late. The suicide narrative we saw over and over was that of missed premonitions. So much so that missed premonitions became one of suicide's necessary variables. Sure, each one could have been stopped, but they also all made sense in the end, given our propensity to overlook the obvious. When you died, we immediately busied ourselves putting all the pieces together, precisely how we were instructed to do. In little time, you became an abstract configuration of warning signs, an emblem of our insensitivity, a sacrifice to the health class gods. I assume it was not your intention to become an example, although without you present to defend your motives, an example is exactly what you became. I don't know why I've remained tethered to you for so long. It could be that I got snagged up somewhere in those Kubler-Ross stages of grief. It could be that I had the kind of childhood full of absences, and yours happened to be the only one that hurt so good. It could be simply that suicide does tricky things to people. It is a bizarre kind of loss, full of answers and empty of ways to access them, much like the series of magic eye posters taped to the walls of our junior high school. Despite extended periods of squinting and eye crossing, I repeatedly failed to detect the hidden images, available only to those with the ability to skew their vision. I grew to detest those posters with their cloaked dinosaurs and sailboats, constant reminders of the limits of my perception.